So Zach, you're going to be coming down next week, in fact, to talk about how GitHub no longer works. But we'll get to that in a little bit because I wanted to chat a little bit about you. Um, you would be one of GitHub's most prominent speakers, or de facto mouthpieces in some ways. Would you agree with that kind of idea?
Yeah, that's probably true, yeah.
Was that a surprise to you? Because you come from you are an engineer,
Yeah.
and it's not typical for that kind of thing to kind of happen. Did you just fall into that?
Yeah, I don't know, it's been kind of a weird thing I sort of stumbled in upon as sort of a job thing for me, I guess. I mean, I was always sort of inspired by the four founders of GitHub were always speaking a lot of different things. I mean, I saw a bunch of their talks at RailsConf 2009 or something, way before I joined GitHub, and that was always really interesting to me. And about the time I started, doing my first talks at GitHub, maybe like 2011 or so, they started, having to operate the GitHub the company a little bit more, so they didn't have as much time to do, conference talks and drink ups and stuff like that. So I don't know, it just kind of worked out time-wise, I think, where I kind of wanted to do a couple talks, and they started doing fewer and fewer talks, so we sort of kind of switched roles like that, I guess.
So probably quite famously in the tech world, and with your reference in this talk was the How GitHub Works talk and a series of blog posts, in fact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, those were just that just kind of stemmed from. I mean, a lot of what we do here stems from things that we were not comfortable with at previous jobs and previous companies. And I had my own experiences where I was just not as happy as I felt like I could be. And I wanted more people to talk about, different ways of working that might be more interesting to you than other ways. Because I don't be the first to say the way that GitHub works is probably not going to work for everybody. But for me, it keeps me really happy with how we build product, and I wanted to have another sort of perspective out there.
So have you got any feedback on that from people who have taken, I mean, in some ways it sits in the canon next to the Valve handbook to an extent. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But have you received feedback from people who've taken some of that and have changed the way that they work?
Yeah, and it's always been kind of interesting to see who ends up doing that. I've talked to a bunch of people, even at like Fortune 50 companies, like really massive companies, and obviously they're not going to change the entire company overnight, but it's really interesting how some people are able to switch their team over to using chat, for example, or from working remotely or something. And that's sort of been the challenge that I like to see people take on, is like, well, what most interests me from how GitHub may tend to do things, and what would work best for how my team works, and for who's on the team. And it's just been really kind of interesting to see how different people put their own spin on it, I guess.
So obviously this talk is kind of coming from the How GitHub Works and scaling it up, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, my problem with I've seen a lot of other companies do talks about, this is how we solve this scaling problem, and then once they become really big and tens of millions of dollars and stuff, you never hear from them again. So that was sort of my grudge that I wanted to fix with this upcoming talk, is to keep talking about things. And I would say some of the most interesting stuff happens once you start getting bigger and more, I don't know, kind of boring, I guess, because you're not doing like the really crazy things anymore that you could do with like 6 people, because you're much larger. And I think that's kind of fun to talk about that as well, because nobody talks about it.
Yeah, and so, I mean, that it seems interesting to be able to take this talk, and because probably one of the complaints about the How GitHub Works stuff is that it doesn't scale,
Mm-hmm.
and obviously you've learned some bits that don't scale, obviously. What was that process like in finding those things that maybe you really liked but couldn't survive a bigger company?
I mean, it's always a process. That was the first How GitHub Works talk or post I did on my blog. We were probably at about 25 people or something, and the same comment comes up all the time. Like, this won't scale to 40 people. This won't scale to 50, to 70, to 100. Then Dunbar's number, and like you can't go past 200 people. And it's I don't know, it's funny because like obviously we're going to change over time, and I think the way we sort of tackle that is I think the thing that GitHub does uniquely well from what I've seen is that people are very kind of unhappy with the status quo, and I think that as a company GitHub does a good job at trying to figure out like, well, this has worked for us for the last 3 or 4 years. But now the same thing that was really awesome is now causing me stress. How can we just go back and just completely rework that? And I think on some level that's what you're going to have to do as you grow bigger as a company. You have to start figuring out what can we actually change? How do we evolve to make sure that things are running just as smoothly now as when we were 20 different employees?
So, I mean, running underneath all of that, there's obviously some pretty core values. How important has been reflecting on those values as you go through this process?
Pretty intensely important, I think. If you look at some of our core values, like one, the value of remote work, we don't necessarily care about where you do your programming work. I think that plays a massive part into every other tiny implementation detail we have at the company. So, we do a lot more things on chat, right, versus standing up at a meeting every morning in the office because not everyone's in the office. So I think and we've come to times where a few times we're like, well, does this still make sense anymore? Do we want to start having more people come to the office? Do we want to start paring down the number of remote workers we have? And up until now, I mean, it's still always been no. Like, remote work is great. Like, it keeps people happier. We are able to attract really great people who would otherwise not come to San Francisco because this city's kind of crazy. So that's been a value that has sort of stuck with us the entire time. And I think that's, it's as you might assume, like, you just have to sit down and figure out, well, what are your values, and are those values something that can change over time? Because sometimes they can, or maybe there's something that just stick with you the entire time, and that's what you're super interested in.
And have there been people, obviously this kind of work is really great for some people and less great for others. How has that process been with, I suppose, people discovering that they can't work like GitHub Works?
Yeah, that's it's something that we've had to learn a lot over time as well, because we've had a few examples of people coming on board who are just really great developers, designers, whatever, but in hindsight you could sort of realize that they're not as comfortable with the sort of workflow that we have. In other words, to sort of, we trust you to just find something, get your teeth into it, and just start building out really interesting things. And I think there are certain types of people, and it's not, obviously right or wrong or anything like that. It's just they thrive underneath a much more concrete direction. So for a long time, it's a really tricky thing to try and figure out from, just the first day or two of an interview, to try and figure out, well, is this person capable of, kind of going off and doing their own thing and fitting in, or, they require a lot more managerial oversight, which is a lot harder for us to provide in our organization right now. And that's something that I think we've gotten better at over time, but it still is kind of tricky, because that's a lot more low-level personality things than anything else, I guess.
And, I mean, looking a little bit more at RubyConf AU itself, what is it that you want people to be able to take away from your talk?
I think, like, when I give these sorts of talks, the thing that I want people to just take away is to just think about this stuff. And again, like, I think how GitHub Works is awesome, but I don't think that's going to work for every single person. I just want you to start thinking about, like, well, how can we make people happier? How can we build things for our employees that make us, more better functioning team? Because that is what I think people don't do enough of. And there's all these different reasons about like, well, yeah, we have deadlines, we have like, this has to happen in the next 4 weeks, otherwise the company will go under or something really terrible. And there's all these excuses that I think that we stop thinking about these sorts of things because it's easy to put on the back burner. Like, oh, I'll fix the company culture in 2 weeks. We just got to fix this, in the first place. And maybe that will buy you survivability for those 2 weeks, but is that the long-term, really good development team that you want? So that's what I want. I want people to start reevaluating these types of things. And I don't think it's necessarily on the onus of like a manager or a VP of engineering or something to figure this stuff out, because I still think, even as like the newest employee, like the lowest level engineer, I think there's a lot of things that you can raise to the team and try and figure out, well, you've been doing this for a couple of years. Is this the right way going forward? Is this what's going to make us as productive as we could? So I think it's on all of us as engineers to try and figure out what the best way forward is to try and make people happier employees. I think being happy at work is probably the best thing.